My name is Elizabeth Rose. I am 32 years old. 2 days ago, at 6 in the morning, I stood on my frost-covered front lawn in Indianapolis and watched a heavy-duty tow truck back into my driveway. Its amber warning lights flashed rhythmically against the dark windows of my house, cutting through the bitter November cold. Standing next to the idling truck, holding a steaming cup of artisan coffee and wearing a pristine camel hair coat, was my older sister Stephanie. She did not look like a grieving granddaughter mourning a recent loss. She looked like a corporate liquidator. She took a delicate sip of her coffee, smiled a bright artificial smile, and said, "Good morning, Lizzie. Hand over the keys. Dad authorized the seizure of Grandpa's Mustang to pay estate debts, and since you are not actually real blood, you have zero legal right to keep family assets." My chest tightened, not from the freezing wind blowing off the plains, but from the sheer audacity of her words. She was trying to steal the 1969 Ford Mustang my grandfather and I had restored together, and she was using the cruelest lie my parents had ever told to do it. But I did not panic. I did not yell. I walked straight past her to the glove box. What I pulled out of that car made the tow truck driver drop his steel chains, wiped that smug smile right off my sister's face, and set off a chain reaction that would legally destroy my greedy family within 48 hours. Before I reveal exactly how I dismantled their entire plan, please take a moment to like and subscribe to Zara Told Stories, but only if you genuinely enjoy a good dose of justice. I would also love to know your age and what state or country you are watching from today. Drop your answers in the comments. To understand how we ended up in a standoff on my front lawn, you have to know how my mind works. I manage supply chain logistics for automotive manufacturers across the Midwest. My days are spent calculating payload distributions, tracking steel shipments from Gary down to Indianapolis, and solving problems before they happen. I rely on facts. I rely on paper. I do not rely on emotion. That pragmatic streak is exactly what saved me when Stephanie tried to blindside me. The rumble of the diesel engine vibrated through the soles of my unlaced boots as I walked down the porch steps. The icy grass crunched under my weight. In my line of work, you learn to identify machinery by sound, and this Peterbilt wrecker sounded hungry. It was angling its broad metal tail directly toward the candy apple red classic car parked on my concrete driveway. "Nobody is touching that vehicle," I said, keeping my tone even and measured. Stephanie rolled her eyes. Her salon blowout remained immaculate despite the swirling wind. "Actually, someone is," she replied, her voice carrying a sweet, condescending pitch that made my stomach knot. "The estate has outstanding debts. This vehicle is a liquid asset. Since you live here, in your little fantasy world, Dad and Mom decided it is time to pull your toys back into the family trust." "The estate has not even cleared probate," I countered, crossing my arms against the chill. "Grandpa died 3 weeks ago. John Caldwell has not read the final directives. Dad does not have the authority to liquidate a single dime." Stephanie stepped closer. She lowered her voice so the driver could not hear. The scent of her expensive floral perfume clashed with the sharp industrial smell of diesel exhaust. "You still do not get it, do you, Dinner? Did you not listen to a word Mom said at dinner last night? You are not real family. You are a charity case they took in out of pity. That means you have zero legal standing. You are not a Rose. You are just a parasite who got lucky." I stared at her. The words were designed to hurt, to break my composure and force a hysterical reaction. In her world, whoever yelled first lost. I let her insult hang in the freezing air, stripping it of its power through my silence. "Hey, lady," the tow truck driver called out. His heavy boots thumped against the asphalt. He pointed a thick-gloved finger at me. "I need the keys so I can unlock the steering column. Otherwise, I have to drag it up the ramp, and that is going to scrape the undercarriage." He was just a guy doing a job, trying to earn his paycheck before the sun came up. He did not know he had been drafted into a family war. "Do not hook those chains," I told him, projecting my voice over the idling engine. Ignore her, Stephanie snapped, her faux cheerfulness evaporating. My father hired you. Load the vehicle right now. The driver hesitated. He looked between the two of us, unspooling a few feet of the braided steel cable. The metal ground loudly against the winch drum. He took a hesitant step toward the Mustang's front bumper. The car was not just a machine. It represented thousands of hours of sanding rust, turning wrenches and smelling like motor oil on Sunday afternoons. It was the only place my grandfather and I truly connected, far away from the suffocating status-obsessed grip of my parents. He taught me how to set the timing belt, how to bleed the brakes, how to listen to the engine block until it purred. It was blue-collar perfection, and Stephanie wanted to sell it to pad her bank account. I bypassed my sister, walking straight to the driver's side of the classic car. The chrome door handle was ice cold. I pressed the thumb button, pulled the heavy door open, and slid into the leather driver's seat. The familiar scent of aged vinyl and gasoline washed over me, steadying my racing pulse. I reached across the center console and popped the latch on the glove box. Inside lay a neatly folded stack of maintenance receipts, a tire pressure gauge, and a heavy document holder. I unzipped the holder and extracted a crisp, watermarked piece of paper. Stepping back out into the cold, I shut the car door with a solid, satisfying thud. I walked straight up to the tow truck operator and held the document out. "Sir," I said, tilting the paper so it caught the glare of his truck headlights. "Read the name printed on the registered owner line." He squinted, pulling down his thick work gloves. His eyes scanned the formal state seal, the vehicle identification number, and finally rested on the bold, typed letters in the center of the page. "Elizabeth Rose," he read aloud. "That is my name," I stated flatly. "I hold the original unencumbered title to this vehicle. It is not part of any estate. It is not tied to any family trust. It belongs solely to me. If you attach a single chain to that bumper, I will call the police and press charges for attempted grand theft auto, and I will name your dispatch company as an accessory." The driver swallowed hard. His face hardened as he looked from the official state title in my hand to Stephanie. She was clutching her coffee cup tight enough to buckle the cardboard. "Lady," the driver said to Stephanie, his voice dropping an octave, "you told dispatch you had the paperwork." "My father is the executor," Stephanie insisted, her voice pitching higher. "He signed the release." "I do not care if your dad is the governor," the driver shot back, clearly annoyed. "She has the title. Her name is on it. I am not catching a felony charge over a rich family dispute." With a sharp, fluid motion, the driver tossed the heavy steel hook back onto his flatbed. The thick chains hit the diamond plate deck with a loud, ringing clank that echoed down the quiet street. It was the sound of my sister losing her leverage. Stephanie clamped her jaw shut. A flush of angry red crept up her neck, disappearing into her pristine coat. She opened her mouth to argue, but the driver was already marching back to his cab. "Call dispatch for your refund," he grunted. He swung himself up into the driver's seat and slammed the door. The air brakes hissed loudly, the truck shifted into gear, and the lumbering vehicle pulled away, leaving nothing but the smell of diesel and the crunch of frost. Stephanie and I were left standing alone on the lawn. The silence between us felt heavy, charged with a decade of unspoken resentment. "You think you won," she sneered, her eyes narrowing into cold slits. "This is just a car. When Caldwell reads the will tomorrow, you are going to walk away with nothing. Mom made sure of that last night. You do not belong to us." She turned on her heel, marching toward her luxury SUV parked on the street. I stood next to the Mustang, sliding the title back into the vinyl folder. My hands were steady, but my mind was racing. Stephanie possessed a dangerous kind of confidence. It was not just arrogance. It was calculated. My family was moving pieces on a board I could not fully see yet. To understand why my sister thought she could steal my car before the sun came up, and why she was so certain I was about to lose everything I have, to take you back 24 hours. I have to take you back to the dinner table, where my parents looked me in the eye and erased my entire existence. 24 hours before the tow truck backed into my driveway, I drove to my parents' home in Carmel. Carmel is an affluent suburb north of Indianapolis, famous for its manicured golf courses, sprawling estates, and people who care deeply about what their neighbors think. My parents, Gerald and Diane, fit right into that mold. Their brick colonial house sat at the end of a quiet, pristine cul-de-sac. Two luxury European SUVs sat in the wide driveway, both leased, both washed weekly to maintain the illusion of endless wealth. I parked my reliable 5-year-old domestic sedan on the street. I walked up the paver-stone walkway, shivering slightly as the November wind bit through my wool coat. I had been summoned for a family dinner. I expected the familiar, comforting smell of roasted chicken or baked garlic bread. I expected a quiet evening, mourning my grandfather, who had passed away just 3 weeks prior. Instead, I walked into a war room. The house smelled of expensive citrus wood polish and stale coffee. The silence inside was thick, broken only by the rhythmic ticking of the antique floor clock in the hallway. I hung my coat in the closet and walked toward the formal dining room, my boots clicking softly against the hardwood floor. The long mahogany dining table was practically invisible. It was buried under stacks of manila folders, ledger printouts, bank statements, and yellow legal pads. Gerald sat at the head of the table. He wore a crisp dress shirt with the sleeves rolled up to his forearms, looking every bit the weary executive. Diane sat to his right, wearing a tailored cashmere sweater. Across from her sat my older sister Stephanie and my younger brother Kyle. Kyle is 28 years old. He has spent the last 5 years bouncing between failed tech startups and vague consulting roles, always subsidized by the bank of mom and dad. Right now, he was leaning over a complex spreadsheet, tracing lines of numbers with a heavy gold pen. They all stopped talking the exact second I crossed the threshold. 4 pairs of eyes snapped toward me. The hostility in the room was a physical weight pressing against my chest. No one said hello. No one asked how my drive was. The silence stretched tight like a piano wire. I stepped further into the room, my eyes scanning the paperwork. I recognized the embossed letterhead on one of the thickest folders. It belonged to John Caldwell, my grandfather's longtime estate attorney. "Are we having a family meeting about the estate without the entire family?" I asked, keeping my tone light despite the sudden drop in my stomach. Gerald sighed heavily. He pulled off his reading glasses and tossed them onto a stack of papers. "This does not concern you, Elizabeth. We are handling the preliminary asset division." "Grandpa left very clear instructions," I said, pulling out the only empty chair at the far end of the table. "The official will reading is scheduled for Thursday morning. Why are you dividing his assets on a Tuesday night?" Diane leaned forward. She rested her wrists on the edge of the polished mahogany. Her right hand reached over to her left wrist. Her fingers found her diamond tennis bracelet. She meticulously adjusted the clasp, rotating the band so the precious stones aligned perfectly with her pulse point. She did not look at me while she did this. She simply stared at the diamonds, turning her wrist back and forth to catch the light from the chandelier overhead. The gesture was highly calculated. It was designed to make me feel small, to remind me of her status and my lack thereof. Finally, she raised her chin and met my gaze. Her eyes were devoid of any maternal warmth. "You do not need to attend the reading on Thursday," Elizabeth Diane said. Her voice was smooth, practiced, and as cold as a marble floor. "Because you are not in the will. You have no legal standing in this family." I froze, my hand still resting on the back of the empty chair. "What are you talking about?" Diane folded her hands over the legal pads. "You are not really our child." She let the words drop like a stone into a quiet pond, watching the ripples spread across my face. Kyle smirked, looking back down at his spreadsheet as if the conversation bored him. Stephanie took a slow sip of her sparkling water, watching me closely over the rim of her crystal glass. Gerald rubbed his temples, acting as though my mere presence was an exhausting inconvenience. Diane continued her story, her tone shifting into a practiced, faux sympathetic rhythm. She claimed I was the byproduct of a distant cousin's reckless mistake, a tragedy they took in out of the goodness of their hearts. She said they raised me, fed me, clothed me, and gave me their prestigious last name because they felt sorry for a forgotten orphan. "But blood is blood," she insisted, her voice hardening, "and the Rose family wealth belongs to the true bloodline. We provided for you for 18 years. We owe you nothing more." I stood motionless behind the chair. The carved wood felt like ice under my palms. I forced myself to breathe in through my nose and out through my mouth. A normal person might have shattered right there. A normal person would have cried, screamed, demanded to see birth certificates, or beg for a retraction. But I manage logistics for a living. My brain is wired to look at supply chain anomalies and diagnose the root cause. I looked at the anomaly sitting at the dining table. My grandfather owned a 500-acre working farm in the fertile Central Plains of Indiana. He owned corporate trust accounts. He owned vintage cars. The total estate hovered around $4 million. My parents, despite their country club memberships and leased luxury vehicles, constantly refinanced this colonial house. They lived entirely on credit, drowning in a lifestyle they could not sustain. Now the patriarch was dead, and the money was supposed to flow downward. But my grandfather despised my father's financial recklessness. They were lying. I knew they were lying, or at least weaponizing a half-truth to manipulate the outcome. They needed me out of the way. If they could convince me I had no legal right to the estate, they could shame me into walking away before John Caldwell ever opened his mouth. They wanted me broken. They wanted me to feel so alienated and worthless that I would simply vanish, leaving my share of the pie for them to devour. "You kept this a secret for 32 years?" I said, my voice remarkably steady, betraying none of the adrenaline flooding my veins. "And you decided to tell me tonight, 3 weeks after Grandpa died, 2 days before the official reading of his estate. The timing is quite convenient, Diane." Gerald stood up. He is a tall man, accustomed to using his physical presence to intimidate contractors and silence dissenters. "Do not take that tone with your mother. We gave you a life. You owe us your gratitude. What you do not owe us is a demand for money that does not belong to you." "I have never asked you for a dime," I replied, holding his gaze without flinching. "I pay my own mortgage. I built my own career. The only thing I want is to hear what Grandpa left in his own words." "Grandpa was an old man," Kyle chimed in, tossing his gold pen onto the table with a loud clatter. "He was confused at the end. Mom and Dad are just trying to protect his true legacy. You showing up on Thursday and demanding a cut of the farm is insulting." I shifted my focus to my brother. "The only thing insulting is you pretending you know the first thing about a working farm, Kyle. The heavy thing you have ever lifted is a country club bar tab." Stephanie slammed her water glass down, the water sloshing over the rim. "Watch your mouth. You are standing in our house. You are a guest here, a charity case." The walls of the dining room seemed to close in. The coordinated attack was seamless, ruthless, and efficient. They had rehearsed this. They had sat around this mahogany table long before I arrived, drafting the perfect script to erase my place in the family tree. Diane was watching my face closely, waiting for my eyes to well up, waiting for my voice to crack. She wanted the emotional breakdown. She thrived on it. Destroying my sense of belonging was just a necessary step in securing her financial future. I did not give her the satisfaction. I let go of the wooden chair and took a step back toward the hallway. "If I am not your child," I said, looking directly into Diane's cold eyes, "then I suppose I do not owe you any filial obedience. I will see you all at John Caldwell's office on Thursday morning, 9 o'clock sharp." I turned my back on them and walked toward the coat closet. I expected them to let me leave, to let the vicious lie fester in my mind overnight and wear down my resolve. But Gerald was not finished. He needed total submission, and my quiet defiance threatened the fragile house of cards he was desperately trying to build. He followed me into the foyer, his heavy footsteps echoing sharply against the tile floor. "You are not going to that office," Gerald warned Hugh, his voice dropping to a menacing, gravelly pitch. "Try and stop me," I said, pulling my wool coat off the hanger. That is when my father played his next card, the one that would send my sister to my driveway with a tow truck the very next morning. Standing on the frost-covered grass, watching the taillights of the wrecker disappear around the corner, my phone vibrated in my coat pocket. The screen illuminated the pre-dawn darkness. The caller identification displayed my father. Gerald was not a man who woke up early unless money was involved. I swiped the green icon and pressed the speaker to my ear, bracing for the inevitable explosion. "You made a very costly mistake this morning," Elizabeth Gerald stated. His voice lacked its usual booming authority, replaced instead by a chilling, razor-thin edge. "Good morning to you too, Gerald," I replied, refusing to use the word Dad. Stephanie forgot to mention she was dropping by, and she definitely forgot to bring a valid court order. "Do not play lawyer with me," he snapped. "That car belongs to the estate. You humiliated your sister in front of a blue-collar contractor, and you defied my direct instructions. I tried to do this quietly. I tried to spare you the public embarrassment, but you are forcing my hand." I began walking back toward my front porch. The adrenaline from the driveway confrontation was fading, allowing the biting wind to cut right through my pajamas. "You do not have a hand to play. You have no legal authority over Grandpa's assets until John Caldwell reads the official directives on Thursday. You know this, I know this, so stop sending repo men to my house." A harsh, humorless laugh echoed through the receiver. It sounded hollow, like a stone dropping down a dry well. "You really think Caldwell holds the only key to this kingdom? You think I would leave my financial future in the hands of some dusty old attorney?" I stopped at the base of my steps. A knot tightened in my stomach. "What are you talking about? I hold a holographic will," Gerald announced. The words hung in the frigid air, heavy and lethal. My mind raced, flipping through legal definitions I had read during my business law electives in college. A holographic will is a handwritten document created and signed by the testator without the presence of witnesses. In the state of Indiana, such documents are notoriously difficult to authenticate, but they can legally override previous formal wills if proven valid. They are the ultimate legal wildcard. "Grandpa would never write a handwritten will," I said, though a tiny fracture of doubt splintered my confidence. "He did exactly that on his final night in hospice," Gerald countered smoothly. "When he finally realized the gravity of his legacy, he saw the big picture. He understood that the 500-acre farm, the trust accounts bowl, the equipment, everything needed to remain under the control of the true family patriarch. He wrote it out on a legal pad. He signed it. It leaves the entirety of his assets to me. You get nothing. Not a single acre of topsoil, not a dollar from the accounts, and certainly not that vintage Mustang." I gripped the phone tighter. The cold seeping into my fingers was nothing compared to the ice forming in my chest. My grandfather had spent his final days heavily medicated, fighting a losing battle against aggressive lung cancer. His mind had drifted in and out of clarity. During those twilight hours, he was vulnerable. If Gerald had stood over his bed, demanding a signature, sliding a pen into his frail hand, could my grandfather have caved? Did he surrender his lifelong principles just to find peace in his final moments? "You are bluffing," I said, but my voice betrayed a slight hesitation. The psychological warfare was working. Gerald knew how to find the cracks in my armor. By claiming I was not his real daughter, the night before he had already isolated me. Now, by inserting this handwritten document into the narrative, he was trying to sever the one true bond I had left. He wanted me to believe my grandfather had abandoned me right at the finish line. I hold the paper in my hand Elizabeth Gerald pressed, sensing my hesitation. It is dated. It is signed. It supersedes whatever dusty binder Caldwell plans to open on Thursday. I have already forwarded a copy to my personal litigators. If you try to fight this, I will drag you through the probate courts for the next decade. I will tie up every asset. I will bury you in legal fees. You will go bankrupt trying to pay retainers, and in the end, the judge will rule in my favor anyway. He paused, letting the threat of financial ruin marinate. Or Gerald continued, his tone softening into a fake paternal cadence. You can take the easy way out. Sign a voluntary waiver of inheritance. Surrender the Mustang by noon today. Walk away quietly. If you do that, I will not sue you for the legal costs I have already incurred. You can go back to your little supply chain job and pretend none of this ever happened. I closed my eyes. The image of the 500-acre farm flashed through my mind. Rolling hills, fertile central plains, the old red barn where Grandpa taught me how to change spark plugs. Gerald did not care about the land. He cared about the subdivision potential. He wanted to pave over a century of agricultural history, sell the parcels to luxury developers, and use the cash to bail out his failing real estate ventures. If he truly held a handwritten directive, he could destroy everything our ancestors built. But as I stood there drowning in manufactured doubt, the silence on the phone stretched a fraction of a second too long. Gerald took a breath, and in that breath I heard it, a slight tremor, a microscopic quiver in his vocal cords. He cleared his throat quickly, trying to mask the sound, but my ear was pressed tight against the speaker. In my logistics career, I negotiate with desperate suppliers every day. I know the exact frequency of a man who is holding a weak hand and trying to bluff a strong opponent. Gerald was breathing too fast. His heart rate was elevated. The confident patriarch facade was cracking under the pressure of his own lies. If this holographic document was a guaranteed victory, he would not be calling me at 6 in the morning offering a settlement. He would not have sent Stephanie to steal the car before sunrise. He would have simply walked into Caldwell's office and dropped the paper on the desk. He was trying to force a surrender because he knew his handwritten paper would never survive actual judicial scrutiny. He was terrified of what would happen if I actually showed up on Thursday. The doubt evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. "You are a terrible poker player, Gerald," I said softly. The line went dead silent. "If you want the car, take me to court," I continued, my voice steady and unyielding. "If you want the farm, present your handwritten napkin to the judge. But do not ever call my phone again, thinking you can scare me into handing over my grandfather's legacy. I will see you on Thursday." I pressed the red button ending the call before he could formulate another threat. I let out a long exhale, watching my breath dissipate into the morning air. I had won the skirmish, but the war was far from over. Gerald and Diane were desperate, and desperate people do not retreat. They simply change their angle of attack. I turned the deadbolt on my front door, stepped inside the warm hallway, and headed toward the kitchen to brew my own pot of coffee. I needed to prepare for a grueling day at the office. I assumed the family drama would remain contained within the legal realm. I assumed their next move would involve lawyers' cease and desist letters, or more pathetic intimidation tactics. I was wrong. Just as I poured the dark roast into my travel mug, my phone screen lit up again. It was not a phone call this time. It was a text message. Then another. Then a social media notification. Then an email alert. My device began vibrating relentlessly across the granite countertop, buzzing like a disturbed hornet nest. I picked it up, staring at the screen in confusion. The messages were not from Gerald or Stephanie. They were from my aunt in Ohio, my cousin in Chicago, a family friend who ran the local bakery down the street. My parents had realized that legal threats were not enough to break me, so they decided to destroy my reputation instead. The social assassination had begun, and Diane was leading the firing squad. The granite countertop in my kitchen was vibrating. It was not a gentle hum, but a frantic, continuous rattling that threatened to push my smartphone right off the polished edge. I set my travel mug down, wiping a drop of spilled dark roast coffee off my thumb. I picked up the device. The lock screen was a waterfall of notification banners, each one stacking on top of the last, faster than my eyes could track them. The Midwest operates on a very specific social currency. In places like Carmel, Indiana, your reputation is built over decades of neighborhood association meetings, charity golf tournaments, and holiday galas. Word travels fast, usually wrapped in a thin veneer of polite concern. My mother, Diane, was a grand master of this game. She knew how to weaponize a prayer request better than a seasoned prosecutor knew how to weaponize a subpoena. I unlocked the screen and tapped the first message. It was from Cousin David in Chicago. "Hey, Lizzie. Heard about what happened at the dinner last night. Sending you peace. Please get the help you need." I frowned, swiping to the next message. This one was from Aunt Carol over in Dayton. "Oh, sweetie, your mother is just heartbroken. We are all praying for your mental stability during this dark episode. Do not push away the people who rescued you." Rescued me. The phrase sent a chill down my spine that had nothing to do with the winter air outside. I opened my email application, digging deeper into the digital avalanche. Someone had forwarded a mass correspondence. I clicked on a screenshot sent by a well-meaning high school friend who still lived in our hometown. There it was. The opening salvo of Diane's coordinated character assassination. The email was dressed up as a sorrowful family update regarding my grandfather's passing. Diane had distributed it to her entire country club mailing list, the extended family tree, and anyone who might hold influence in our local circle. I read my mother's prose. She had spun a masterpiece of fiction. She painted a tragic picture of a grieving family trying to hold together their patriarch's legacy, only to be terrorized by a deeply disturbed young woman. Diane claimed I was suffering a severe psychiatric break brought on by grief. But the most venomous part was how she framed my identity. She formally introduced the lie they had tested on me at the dining room table just hours earlier. She wrote that the family was struggling to manage my erratic behavior, especially considering I was never a true Rose by blood, but rather a troubled ward they had taken in out of Christian charity. I scrolled further down, finding a specific text thread. It was a group chat my mother had created with the elder women of our extended family. A screenshot from that chat had been leaked to me by a guilty relative who felt the gossip had gone too far. Diane had typed a paragraph that made my blood run cold. It read, "It is just so tragic. We gave Elizabeth every advantage when we took her in. We tried to overwrite her origins with a good home. I have always loved her despite her bad genetics, but this extortion attempt is tearing Gerald apart. We just want her to get psychiatric help before she hurts herself or our family name." My chest felt tight like steel bands were constricting my ribs. Bad genetics. Extortion. She was branding me a volatile outsider, an ungrateful parasite trying to steal from her generous saviors. The goal was crystal clear. By the time I walked into John Caldwell's law office on Thursday morning, Diane wanted me to be a pariah. She wanted to ensure that if I spoke the truth about their bankruptcy or the tow truck, everyone in our social circle would view it as the rambling delusions of a sick, greedy orphan. She was isolating me, cutting off any potential allies before the real legal battle even began. I walked into the living room and sank onto the leather sofa. The digital onslaught continued. My phone buzzed in my palm, a relentless drumbeat of pity and judgment from people who had known me my entire life. My thumbs hovered over the keyboard. The urge to fight back was a physical ache in my knuckles. I wanted to draft a public post. I wanted to upload a picture of the Peterbilt wrecker sitting in my driveway. I wanted to expose Gerald's fake handwritten napkin. I wanted to scream into the digital void that I was a logistics coordinator handling multi-million-dollar supply chains, not some fragile charity case having a mental breakdown. I wanted to burn their pristine leased country club image to ash right there on the internet. But I paused. I watched the cursor blink on a blank screen. My logistics training kicked in, overriding the surge of adrenaline. If a supplier sends a flawed shipment of steel, you do not burn down the warehouse in retaliation. You document the error, you hold your ground, and you use the contract to dismantle their leverage. Diane wanted me to react. If I posted a furious emotional rant online, I would play right into her crafted narrative. I would look unhinged. I would validate her claim that I was spiraling out of control. She had set a trap, lined with my own righteous anger, waiting for me to step into it and prove her point. I deleted the drafted response. I closed the social media applications. I opened my phone settings and muted all notifications from every family member and family friend. I dropped the device into my leatherwork tote, sealing the zipper with a sharp pull. Strategic silence is often the most deafening response you can give to a narcissist. By refusing to engage, I was denying Diane the ammunition she desperately craved. Let them talk. Let Aunt Carol pray for my stability. Let the country club housewives whisper over their morning mimosas. The court of public opinion does not sign binding legal decrees. John Caldwell did. I just needed to hold the line, keep my head clear, and survive until Thursday. I grabbed my car keys, taking a deep breath of the quiet air in my hallway. I felt a grim sense of accomplishment. I had successfully weathered the morning assault. The tow truck was gone, the fake will threat was neutralized by calling Gerald's bluff, the social smear campaign was muted in my bag. I walked out to my reliable sedan, started the engine, and merged onto the highway. I drove toward my office park on the north side of Indianapolis, ready to lose myself in spreadsheets, freight manifests, and shipping routes. Work was my sanctuary. It was a realm governed by hard data, predictable algorithms, and signed contracts. It was a place where my parents had no reach, no influence, and no power. Within the walls of my corporate office, I was not a troubled ward or a bad genetic investment. I was Elizabeth Rose, the person who kept the assembly lines running, or so I thought. I parked in my designated spot, swiped my security badge at the glass entry doors of the corporate headquarters, and walked toward my cubicle with a renewed sense of purpose. The familiar hum of the air conditioning and the clatter of keyboards usually settled my nerves. But before I could even take my wool coat off, my desk phone began ringing. It was not the gentle internal ring used by my colleagues. It was the harsh double ring indicating an external crisis call on my direct line. I picked up the receiver, expecting to hear from a dispatcher dealing with a flat tire on Interstate 65 or a delayed shipment out of Gary. Instead, I heard the panicked, elevated voice of the purchasing director for my largest automotive steel supplier. He was not calling to confirm a payload. He was calling to ask why my brother was suddenly trying to cancel our most lucrative freight contracts, and why Kyle was demanding that all future logistics accounts be routed through a third-party firm, due to my unexpected indefinite medical leave. The voice on the other end of the receiver belonged to Marcus Thorne. Marcus was the purchasing director for Vanguard Steel, our most lucrative logistics account. Vanguard supplied raw materials to 3 major automotive assembly lines in the state of Indiana. If their freight was delayed by even 4 hours, an entire factory ground to a halt, costing millions of dollars. Marcus was a man who spoke in tight, efficient sentences, but right now his voice was pitched high with panic. Elizabeth Marcus set his breathing shallow over the line. I need you to explain why a third-party broker is trying to reroute our designated fleet for the upcoming quarter. And I need to know why he claims you have been placed on indefinite psychiatric leave. My grip on the plastic phone receiver tightened until my knuckles turned white. A cold wave of adrenaline washed over my shoulders. I am not on leave, Marcus, I stated, keeping my tone perfectly level, projecting a calm I absolutely did not feel. I am sitting at my desk, reviewing your current manifests. Every single shipment is running ahead of schedule. Who exactly contacted you? A man named Kyle Rose Marcus replied. He said he was your brother stepping in as a family proxy. He sent over a rather alarming email this morning, outlining your sudden mental health crisis. He attached a transfer agreement instructing us to shift our supply chain contracts to Apex Freight Solutions. He claimed your firm was dissolving your division due to your incapacity. Apex Freight Solutions was our biggest regional competitor. They were notorious for offering hefty, under-the-table kickbacks to anyone who brought them high-volume accounts. The pieces snapped together with sickening clarity. Kyle was 28 years old and functionally allergic to honest labor. He had spent his entire adult life bouncing from one failed startup to another, always chasing the illusion of fast money while surviving on my parents' credit cards. When Diane launched her social smear campaign that morning, branding me a volatile, unstable ward, Kyle did not just see a way to hurt me. He saw an opportunity to monetize my destruction. By weaponizing our mother's narrative, he was attempting to execute a hostile takeover of my professional portfolio. If he successfully terrified Vanguard Steel into signing with Apex Freight, he would pocket a massive finder fee. He was willing to burn down my entire career to fund his country club lifestyle. Marcus, I said, my voice dropping into a register of absolute authority. Please forward that email to me immediately. Do not sign anything. I guarantee your supply lines are secure. Give me 10 minutes to resolve this internally. I hung up the phone and waited for the notification to pop up on my monitor. The email arrived seconds later. I clicked it open, my eyes scanning the text rapidly. Kyle had drafted a masterpiece of corporate sabotage. He used official-sounding language to mask a deeply personal attack. He referenced the tragic loss of our grandfather and expressed deep sorrow that the grief had triggered a severe psychological breakdown in his sister. He cited his duty to protect the region's supply chain from my erratic behavior. It was the exact same script Diane had fed to the country club housewives, neatly repackaged for a corporate boardroom. He was committing tortious interference, and he was leaving a digital paper trail to prove it. I did not waste time panicking. I printed the email. I pulled up Vanguard Steel's quarterly performance metrics, printing out charts that proved a flawless 99% on-time delivery rate under my management. I grabbed the stack of papers and marched out of my cubicle, heading straight for the corner office at the end of the hall. Hank was the regional director of our logistics firm. He was a grizzled, no-nonsense manufacturing veteran who had spent 30 years walking factory floors before moving into upper management. He commanded respect because he earned it through grit and an encyclopedic knowledge of interstate commerce. He did not care about pedigree or social status. He only cared about results. I knocked twice on his heavy oak door and walked in without waiting for an invitation. Hank looked up from his dual monitors, his bushy gray eyebrows knitted together in surprise. He held a glossy, thick cardstock rectangle between his thick fingers. Elizabeth Hank grunted, his voice like gravel grinding under a tire. I was just about to call you in here. We have a strange situation brewing. I stepped up to his massive wooden desk and placed the performance charts directly over his keyboard. The situation is handled, I said. Hank dropped the glossy rectangle onto the desktop. I recognized it immediately. It was a flashy, oversized business card. Kyle Rose, Independent Logistics Consultant, was printed across the center in embossed gold lettering. My brother had actually driven to my corporate headquarters, bypassed the reception desk, and dropped his unsolicited contact information on my boss's desk. "Your brother stopped by an hour ago, before you badged in," Hank said, leaning back in his leather chair. "He spun quite a tale. Told me your family was staging a medical intervention today. Suggested I offload your accounts to a proxy firm he represents to protect our quarterly revenue. He even offered to negotiate the transfer himself." Hank picked up the business card again, studying it with a look of pure disgust. I took a deep breath, maintaining absolute eye contact with the man who controlled my professional future. "Hank," I said steadily, "my grandfather passed away 3 weeks ago. He left a substantial estate. My family is currently attempting to extort me out of my rightful inheritance by manufacturing a narrative that I am mentally unstable and not truly part of their bloodline. My brother is using that fabricated family drama to commit corporate fraud and steal our clients for a kickback from Apex Freight." I pointed to the papers I had placed on his desk. "Those are Vanguard's metrics for the last 90 days. Perfect execution. I just got off the phone with their purchasing director. Kyle sent him an email trying to force a contract breach. I have the printed correspondence right there." Hank did not say a word. He picked up the printed email, adjusting his reading glasses. He read Kyle's words in silence. The ticking of the wall clock was the only sound in the office. I stood perfectly still, letting my flawless professional record speak louder than my brother's lies. Hank was a man who hated corporate espionage almost as much as he hated lazy opportunists. He saw right through the polished vocabulary of Kyle's email, recognizing it for the cheap hustle it was. Hank pulled off his glasses. He picked up Kyle's gold-embossed business card, holding it between his thumb and index finger. "Let me tell you something about boys who print their names in gold before they ever move a single pallet of freight," Hank said, his tone dripping with contempt. "They always fold the second the weather turns bad." With a flick of his wrist, Hank tossed Kyle's unsolicited business card across the room. It fluttered through the air and landed perfectly inside the metal mesh trash can in the corner. "I will handle Apex Freight," Hank continued, his expression turning predatory. "Our legal department is going to send a cease and desist order so aggressive your brother will need a loan just to read it. As for Vanguard Steel, call Marcus back. Assure him our firm stands behind you 100%. Tell him if he receives another communication from Kyle Rose, our corporate attorneys will consider it harassment." "Thank you, Hank," I said, feeling the tight band around my chest finally begin to loosen. "Do not thank me for doing my job, Elizabeth," he replied, turning back to his monitors. "Just make sure you protect your flanks. People who play this dirty do not stop just because they miss the first swing. Now get back to work. We have trucks moving." I walked out of the corner office with my career intact, but the adrenaline crash hit me the moment I stepped back into the hallway. My knees felt weak. My hands were trembling slightly as I reached my cubicle. Hank was right. They were not going to stop. In the span of 6 hours, my family had tried to steal my vintage car, destroyed my reputation among my relatives, and attempted to incinerate my livelihood. They were trying to starve me out, attacking every pillar of my independence so I would crawl into John Caldwell's law office on Thursday morning, shattered and compliant. I sat down in my rolling chair, staring blankly at the spreadsheets glowing on my monitors. The walls of the office suddenly felt suffocating. I needed to breathe. I needed a moment away from the ringing phones, the email alerts, and the constant vigilance required to fend off my own blood relatives. I checked my watch. It was nearing the lunch hour. I grabbed my wool coat and my leather tote bag, quietly slipping out the side exit of the building. I did not want to sit in a crowded cafe or a sterile break room. I needed a sanctuary. I needed the one place where the lies could not reach me, a place built on the solid, undeniable truth of my grandfather's love. I drove the short distance back to my townhouse. The driveway was empty, free of tow trucks and treacherous sisters. The candy apple red paint of the 1969 Mustang gleamed under the pale winter sun. I unlocked the heavy door and climbed into the driver's seat, shutting out the biting wind. The familiar scent of old leather and motor oil wrapped around me like a heavy blanket. I rested my forehead against the cold steering wheel, finally allowing myself a moment of silence. I reached over to the passenger seat to put my bag down, my elbow brushing against the chrome latch of the glove box. The latch popped open. I reached inside to secure the vinyl document folder holding the car title. As my fingers brushed the thick stack of maintenance receipts, my thumb caught on the edge of a small, worn logbook. It was my grandfather's handwriting, detailing oil changes and tire rotations, but as I pulled the logbook out to properly align it, a secondary document folded into perfect thirds slipped from between the pages and landed on my lap. I had never seen this paper before. I unfolded it slowly, expecting a parts receipt or a registration slip. Instead, I found a legal corporate holding receipt, and the words printed at the top would change the trajectory of my entire life. The scent hit me first. A deeply familiar blend of aged vinyl, rich worn leather, and the faint metallic tang of motor oil. Sitting in the driver's seat of the 1969 Ford Mustang felt like stepping inside a time capsule. The heavy steel doors shut out the bitter November wind, and for a fleeting moment, they also shut out the relentless cruelty of my parents. I pressed my forehead against the cold, rigid rim of the steering wheel. I closed my eyes, letting the ambient sounds of the suburban neighborhood fade away. My grandfather, Thomas Rose, was a man who believed in tangible things. He did not trust speculative real estate or leveraged credit, which was the exact foundation of my father Gerald's entire existence. Grandpa trusted topsoil. He trusted cast iron engine blocks. He trusted the sweat equity of a hard day of labor. As the comforting aroma of the classic car filled my lungs, a specific memory pushed its way to the forefront of my mind. I was 15 years old, standing in the drafty wooden barn on his 500-acre farm. We were covered in grease trying to rebuild the carburetor of this very vehicle. Gerald had visited earlier that afternoon, wearing a tailored suit and sporting a fresh manicure to beg for another business loan. Grandpa had refused, sending his son away furious. After Gerald's luxury SUV sped down the gravel driveway, Grandpa had wiped his stained hands on a shop rag, looked at me, and delivered a lesson I never forgot. People place too much faith in genetics, Lizzie. He had told me, his voice a low, gravelly rumble. They think sharing a last name gives them a free pass to act like scavengers. But blood is just a biological liquid. Loyalty is iron. You build it, you maintain it, and it holds the frame together when the road gets rough. Those words echoed in the quiet cabin of the Mustang. They stood in stark contrast to Diane's vicious text messages about my bad genetics. My grandfather knew exactly who I was, and he knew exactly who they were. He would never have surrendered his life's work to a son who viewed the family legacy as a personal ATM. I lifted my head from the steering wheel. The chrome latch of the glove box was open, the small door hanging downward. I reached over the passenger seat to push it shut, but my knuckles brushed against a thick, weathered book tucked beneath the insurance cards. I pulled it out. It was a small maintenance log bound in cracked black leather. I opened the cover. The pages were filled with my grandfather's meticulous, slanting cursive. He had recorded every oil change, every spark plug replacement, every tire rotation. The dates stretched back decades. Flipping through the thin paper felt like reading a diary of devotion. But as I reached the final few pages near the back cover, a different kind of document slipped free. It was a heavy, watermarked piece of paper, folded into perfect thirds. It did not belong in a mechanic's logbook. I caught the paper before it fell onto the floor mats. The material was thick, the kind used by expensive law firms for official decrees. I smoothed the creases over the steering column, tracing the embossed seal near the top margin. It was a corporate holding receipt, drafted by the law offices of John Caldwell, dated 18 months prior. My eyes scanned the legal terminology. It referenced the vehicle identification number of the Mustang I was currently sitting inside. But it was not a standard bill of sale. It was a transfer of asset declaration. The document explicitly stated that the classic car had been removed from the personal ownership of Thomas Rose and placed directly into an entity titled the Rose Legacy Trust. A secondary clause near the bottom of the page caught my immediate attention. It named the designated beneficiary of this specific asset upon the grantor's death: Elizabeth Rose. I read the words 3 times. My heart began to pound a steady, powerful rhythm against my ribs. The exhaustion that had weighed me down all morning began to evaporate, replaced by a razor-sharp crystalline focus. In my logistics career, I dismantle complex supply chains to understand how materials move from a point of origin to a final destination. I applied that exact same analytical framework to the legal document resting in my hands. The implications of this single sheet of paper were staggering. It was the crucial puzzle piece that exposed the sheer magnitude of my father's lies. Gerald had called me at dawn, attempting to terrorize me with a holographic will. He claimed my grandfather had written a deathbed directive on a napkin, leaving the entire 500-acre farm and all financial assets solely to him. In the state of Indiana, a handwritten will can sometimes challenge a formal testament if it goes through a grueling probate process. But a trust is a different mechanism. A trust is an impenetrable legal fortress. Assets held within a corporate trust do not go through probate court. They are not governed by a last will and testament, whether that will is drafted by a high-priced lawyer or scribbled by a dying man on a piece of scrap paper. Once an asset is transferred into a trust, the original owner no longer legally holds it, the trust does. My grandfather did not just write a will. He had quietly and methodically restructured his entire $4 million empire. He had built a labyrinth of corporate protection right under Gerald's nose. If the Mustang was shielded inside the Rose Legacy Trust, it was a statistical certainty that the farm, the equipment, and the bank accounts were locked inside it as well. The holographic will Gerald had weaponized against me was not just a forgery. It was a useless piece of fiction. Gerald could march into a courtroom with 100 handwritten letters, and the judge would laugh him out of the building. You cannot bequeath assets you do not personally own. The realization hit me like a physical shockwave. My grandfather had foreseen this exact scenario. He knew his son was drowning in debt. He knew Diane would launch a campaign of social warfare. He knew Stephanie and Kyle would swarm like vultures. To protect his legacy and to protect me, he had bypassed the probate system entirely. The trust was his ironclad shield, and this receipt was the proof. Gerald's desperate morning phone call suddenly made perfect sense. He was not calling from a position of strength. He was calling from a state of sheer, blind panic. He knew Caldwell was sitting on a trust document. He knew the reading on Thursday would expose him as a penniless tenant in his own father's kingdom. His only chance of survival was to mentally break me, to force me into signing a waiver of inheritance before the truth saw the light of day. The fake parentage narrative. The tow truck. The coordinated character assassination across our Midwestern social circle. Kyle's illegal sabotage of my automotive steel contracts. It was all a frantic, coordinated smokescreen. They were trying to starve me out, hoping I would surrender my seat at the table out of sheer emotional exhaustion. I carefully folded the watermarked receipt and slid it into the inner pocket of my wool coat. I pressed my hand against the fabric, feeling the crisp edge of the paper resting against my chest. I had spent the last 48 hours on the defensive, reacting to their ambushes and dodging their daggers. I had tried to take the high road, muting my phone and maintaining strategic silence, but taking the high road does not stop a syndicate of bullies. It only emboldens them. My grandfather had armed me with the truth, and it was time I stopped playing the victim. It was time I went on the offensive. I checked the dashboard clock. It was early afternoon. Tonight was the annual Regional Commerce Charity Gala in downtown Indianapolis. It was the premier social event of the season for the Carmel elite. Gerald and Diane never missed it. They used the gala to rub elbows with prominent politicians, wealthy donors, and corporate executives desperately projecting the illusion of infinite wealth to secure more lines of credit. My logistics firm was one of the platinum sponsors for the evening. I had received a VIP invitation weeks ago. I had originally planned to skip the event, preferring a quiet evening at home over forced corporate mingling. But the game had changed. Diane thought she had successfully painted me as an unstable, hysterical outcast. She thought I was hiding in my townhouse, weeping over her cruel text messages and Kyle's corporate espionage. She believed she controlled the narrative. I turned the key in the ignition. The powerful 8-cylinder engine roared to life, shaking the chassis with a deep, resonant growl. I was going to put on my best evening gown. I was going to walk into that ballroom, and I was going to look my mother right in the eyes. The grand ballroom of the downtown Indianapolis Convention Center glowed under the weight of 3 massive tiered chandeliers. It was Friday evening, and the annual Regional Commerce Charity Gala was in full swing. This event was the undisputed crown jewel of the Midwestern winter social season. It drew the wealthiest real estate developers, the most influential automotive executives, and the highest-ranking state politicians into a single, velvet-lined arena. Waiters in crisp black vests navigated the crowded floor, balancing silver trays loaded with champagne flutes and artisan hors d'oeuvres. The air hummed with the sophisticated low murmur of high-stakes networking, underscored by a live string quartet playing near the entrance. I stood near the edge of the dance floor, holding a flute of sparkling water. I wore a tailored midnight blue silk evening gown, a garment chosen specifically for its understated authority. I was not there to blend in, nor was I there to desperately attract attention. I attended as the designated VIP representative for my logistics firm, occupying a seat at a platinum-sponsored table right near the main stage. My boss, Hank, had purchased the table weeks ago to entertain our top steel suppliers. Tonight, the ballroom was not just a venue for corporate philanthropy. It was a battlefield. I knew Gerald and Diane would be here. They never missed an opportunity to photograph themselves wearing formal attire alongside local dignitaries. For my parents, social climbing was a full-time occupation. They treated these events like oxygen, desperately inhaling the perceived status of everyone around them to mask the suffocating reality of their own financial rot. From my vantage point near the ice sculpture, I scanned the sea of tuxedos and designer dresses. It did not take long to spot them. Gerald wore a velvet dinner jacket, his silver hair swept back perfectly. Diane stood at his side in a sequined crimson dress, projecting the image of a fearless matriarch. They were working the room with practiced efficiency, offering firm handshakes and bright, hollow smiles to anyone who glanced their way. I watched my mother smoothly navigate a conversation with a local judge, her posture rigid, her laughter ringing out a fraction of a second too late to be genuine. This was the woman who had spent her morning texting our entire extended family, branding me an unstable, greedy orphan. She was currently gliding across the polished floor, playing the role of the benevolent, grieving daughter-in-law. It was a masterclass in deception. I remained in the shadows of the ice sculpture, letting the crowd flow around me. I watched them drift toward the far wall, where the silent auction was displayed across a long banquet table draped in white linen. The items up for bid were extravagant. Signed sports memorabilia, exclusive country club memberships, and luxury vacation packages. I stepped closer, maintaining a strategic distance using a towering floral arrangement as cover. I wanted to observe their behavior when they thought no one of consequence was watching. Diane stopped in front of a framed certificate offering a 2-week stay at a private vineyard in Napa Valley. The starting bid was $10,000. She picked up the heavy gold pen resting on the bid sheet. I could see the calculated greed in her eyes. Winning an item like that was not about the vacation. It was about the public announcement at the end of the night. It was about hearing the auctioneer declare Gerald and Diane Rose as the highest bidders, cementing their status among the Carmel elite. She signed her name on the top line, scribbling a number with a dramatic flourish. An auction attendant, a young man wearing a headset and holding a mobile payment terminal, approached her. To secure the bid, attendees were required to swipe a credit card to place a temporary hold on the funds. Diane reached into her sequined clutch and produced a black metallic credit card, handing it over with a practiced, haughty grace. The attendant swiped the card through the terminal. He waited a few seconds, looking down at the digital screen. A slight frown formed on his face. He tapped a button and swiped the card a second time, a bit slower. The machine emitted a low, discreet beep. "I am sorry, ma'am," the attendant said, his voice polite but audible over the string quartet. "The terminal is returning a declined status. Do you have an alternate form of payment we can use for the hold?" I stood perfectly still, watching the exact moment the polished armor of Diane Rose cracked. Her eyes widened. Her eyelids began to flutter in a rapid, frantic blinking pattern. It was a physical tell I had seen 100 times during my childhood, whenever she lost control of a situation. Her throat worked as she swallowed hard. The crimson sequins on her dress seemed to mock the sudden, pale shade of her face. Gerald quickly stepped forward, placing a heavy hand on her shoulder. He shot the attendant a cold, dismissive glare. There must be a security hold on the account, due to the unusual transaction amount. Gerald lied smoothly, his jaw tight. "We will sort it out with our wealth manager in the morning. Cancel the bid." He snatched the black card from the attendant's hand and pulled Diane away from the auction table. They retreated toward a quieter corner of the ballroom, their previous confident swagger replaced by stiff, jerky movements. I took a sip of my sparkling water, letting the carbonation burn the back of my throat. The irony was intoxicating. The woman who had labeled me a parasite was currently holding a piece of useless plastic, unable to afford a temporary hold on a charity bid. Her entire social empire was built on a foundation of maxed-out credit limits and unpaid invoices. They were drowning just as the trust document in my glove box had indicated. Instead of feeling pity, a cold resolve settled over me. I stepped out from behind the floral arrangement and walked directly into the center of the room, into the brightest lights of the chandeliers. It took less than 2 minutes for the inevitable collision. Diane was still recovering from her financial humiliation, scanning the room to ensure no one important had witnessed the declined transaction. Her gaze swept across the dance floor and slammed right into me. I did not avert my eyes. I stood tall in my midnight blue silk, radiating the calm authority of a woman who earned every single thing she wore. For a fraction of a second, genuine shock paralyzed my mother's features. She had convinced herself I was curled up in a fetal position in my townhouse, destroyed by her smear campaign. Seeing me here, standing proudly among the very people she worshipped, short-circuited her brain. But Diane was a predator. When backed into a corner, she did not flee, she attacked. Her shock morphed into a hard, calculating glare. I watched her scan the immediate vicinity, her eyes locking onto a group of influential figures standing just a few feet away. The group included City Councilman Montgomery, his wife, and a prominent commercial real estate developer, Gerald desperately needed for a loan extension. Diane adjusted her posture, smoothing the fabric of her dress. She plastered a sickeningly sweet smile onto her face and gestured for the group to follow her. She led the wealthy delegation straight across the ballroom floor, marching directly toward my position. She was going to use me to regain her lost footing. She was going to execute a public ambush to reassert her dominance. Elizabeth Diane called out. Her voice was artificially loud, designed to cut through the ambient noise and draw the attention of the surrounding tables. I turned to face her as she closed the distance, dragging the bewildered politicians in her wake. "I am so surprised you left your house tonight," Diane said, projecting her voice so the councilman and the developer could hear every syllable. "We were all so terribly worried about your fragile state of mind." She turned to Councilman Montgomery, placing a delicate hand on her chest in a theatrical display of maternal sorrow. "Councilman," she said, leaning into the title to imply a false intimacy. "Allow me to introduce Elizabeth. She is the former charity case Gerald and I took in years ago when she had nowhere else to go. We tried our best to give her a proper upbringing, but she has been struggling terribly since my father-in-law passed." The councilman blinked, clearly uncomfortable with the sudden oversharing of intimate family trauma. His wife offered me a tight, pitying smile, taking a small step back as if mental instability was contagious. Diane turned her gaze back to me. Her eyes were sharp, glittering with malicious triumph. She thought she had won. She thought she had trapped me in a social vice, forcing me to either throw a hysterical tantrum in front of the city elite or lower my head in submissive shame and flee the ballroom. She was using her manufactured identity crisis to strip me of my dignity in front of the people she valued most. Elizabeth Diane continued, her tone dripping with poisoned honey. "I really do not think a loud, crowded gala is the right environment for someone suffering from your kind of psychological distress. Why do you not let Gerald call you a taxi? We can handle your therapeutic needs in private, away from civilized company." The surrounding guests fell silent. The clinking of glasses ceased. Everyone within earshot was staring at me, waiting to see how the troubled charity case would react to the gracious, long-suffering matriarch. Diane waited for my shoulders to slump. She waited for the tears to fill my eyes. I did not give her a single tear. I did not retreat a single inch. Instead, I tightened my grip on my crystal glass and prepared to dismantle her entire universe. The silence surrounding our small cluster of guests grew heavy, stretching out like a pulled rubber band about to snap. You could hear the faint scrape of leather shoes against the polished parquet floor as the crowd subtly leaned in, hungry for the promised drama. Diane stood with her chin held high, wearing a triumphant, expectant smile. She anticipated my shoulders collapsing under the weight of her public shaming. She wanted a frantic denial, a tearful apology, or a rapid retreat toward the coat check. She wanted to prove to the Carmel elite that I was exactly the broken, unstable outsider she claimed I was. I took a slow, measured sip of my sparkling water. The crystal flute felt cool and solid against my palm. I lowered the glass, maintaining unbroken eye contact with my mother. "Thank you for your concern, Diane," I said. My voice carried a calm, resonant clarity that easily cut through the ambient chatter of the ballroom. I made sure my tone was entirely void of the hysteria she had just advertised to her influential friends. "It is incredibly generous of you to check on my well-being during such a high-profile evening. Your charity truly knows no bounds." Diane blinked. Her triumphant smile faltered for a fraction of a second, the corners of her mouth twitching. She had anticipated resistance or a meltdown. She had not anticipated weaponized politeness delivered with the icy precision of a corporate negotiator. I turned my attention to the prominent figure standing beside her. I offered a warm, professional nod to the city official. "It is a pleasure to see you tonight, Councilman Montgomery. And you as well, Mr. Vance." I addressed the commercial real estate developer by name, noting the slight widening of his eyes. I recognized him immediately. Arthur Vance owned half the commercial zoning parcels in the northern suburbs. My logistics firm managed the freight routing for several of his largest construction sites. He was a man who built empires on solid concrete and reliable credit. Mr. Vance raised a thick gray eyebrow, clearly surprised that the supposed troubled ward knew exactly who he was. "Good evening, Elizabeth," he replied, his tone cautious but polite, sensing the shifting undercurrents of the conversation. I shifted my gaze toward my father. Gerald had been standing slightly behind Diane, acting as the silent, supportive patriarch. He wore a crisp velvet jacket, looking every inch the wealthy titan of industry. But I knew the truth hidden behind the velvet. I knew about the declined credit card at the silent auction table. I knew his properties were underwater. I knew the Rose Legacy Trust held the actual wealth he was desperately trying to steal. I decided to pull the curtain back and let the elite circles see the rot hiding behind the velvet. "Gerald," I said, allowing a look of deep, empathetic concern to wash over my features. "Since we are sharing family updates in public, I wanted to ask how your recent negotiations with the local steel mills are progressing." Gerald stiffened. The color drained from his face in a sudden rush, leaving his skin an ashen, sickly gray against his dark lapels. "What are you talking about?" he muttered, his voice dropping into a harsh, warning whisper. I tilted my head, keeping my expression perfectly innocent, playing the role of a concerned daughter to perfection. "The credit extensions," I clarified, speaking loud enough for Arthur Vance to hear every single syllable. "My logistics team tracks raw material flow across the state. I noticed a significant disruption in the supply chain routing toward your new commercial development projects on the east side. The rumor on the freight floor is that the suppliers are demanding cash up front because your accounts are severely overleveraged. I know how stressful 90-day past due invoices can be on a man your age. Are you managing the pressure okay?" The effect was instantaneous and devastating. In the high-stakes world of commercial real estate, liquidity is everything. Debt is a common tool, but cash flow issues are a terminal disease. To whisper about insolvency in a ballroom full of investors is akin to yelling fire in a crowded theater. The dramatic irony hung thick in the warm air of the convention center. The audience, the wealthy patrons and the politicians, had all assumed I was the fragile outcast teetering on the edge of ruin. But I was the one holding the ledger, and Gerald was the one standing on a trap door. Arthur Vance, the developer, whose good graces Gerald desperately needed for a loan extension, reacted immediately. His polite, diplomatic smile vanished. He looked at Gerald, his eyes narrowing as his mental calculator tallied the implications of my statement. He took a distinct physical step backward, creating a visible gap between himself and my father. In the silent, unspoken language of the elite, that single step was a financial execution. Gerald opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He looked like a fish suffocating on a dry dock. His mind scrambled to formulate a convincing denial, but he knew I possessed the internal freight receipts to prove my claim. He was trapped in a prison built by his own ambition. Diane tried to intervene, her voice shrill and laced with rising panic. "Elizabeth, stop this nonsense at once! You are having an episode. You do not know what you are talking about." I turned back to my mother, offering a serene, unbothered smile that mirrored the one she had given me at the dinner table 2 nights prior. "I know exactly what I am talking about, Diane. I manage multi-million-dollar supply chains for a living. I read balance sheets before I drink my morning coffee. I know precisely where the steel goes, and more importantly, I know exactly who cannot afford to pay for it." Councilman Montgomery cleared his throat, suddenly finding the towering ice sculpture nearby fascinating. His wife gripped her beaded evening clutch tightly, her eyes darting between Diane's flushed, panicked face and my steady, unwavering posture. The narrative Diane had spent all day crafting was dissolving into dust right before their eyes. A woman suffering a psychiatric break does not politely dissect a man's commercial credit rating in front of his primary investors. I took another sip of my water, letting the silence stretch until it became agonizing for them. I had stripped away their primary weapon. Their reputation was their shield, their currency, and their sword. With a few carefully chosen sentences grounded in undeniable logistics data I had, shattered it. "Well," I said, setting my crystal flute onto a passing waiter's silver tray with a soft clink. "I should let you all get back to your evening. Hank purchased a platinum table near the stage for our top automotive clients, and I need to return to hosting our guests. It was lovely catching up." I looked directly into Gerald's hollow eyes. "Good luck with those invoices, Gerald. Let me know if you need a recommendation for a reliable bankruptcy attorney. I hear they are very discreet." I turned my back on them and walked away. I did not rush. I did not look over my shoulder. I glided across the ballroom floor with my head held high, leaving my parents drowning in the social awkwardness they had orchestrated. The whispers began before I even reached my table. I could feel the ripple effect spreading through the crowd as Arthur Vance quietly excused himself from Gerald's presence, severing their professional ties without saying a word. The rest of the gala passed in a blur of polite corporate conversation and catered cuisine. I discussed shipping logistics with automotive executives, laughed at Hank's dry industry jokes, and ate a perfectly cooked cut of tenderloin. Every time I glanced across the room, I saw Gerald and Diane standing alone. The elite circle they had fought so hard to penetrate was suddenly giving them a wide berth. The stench of financial desperation is impossible to wash off once it is exposed under chandelier lights. I left the convention center just before midnight. The winter air felt crisp and clean against my skin, flushing the stale air of the ballroom from my lungs. I handed my ticket to the valet, tipped him generously, and drove my sedan back to my townhouse. When I unlocked my front door, the quiet emptiness of my home felt different. It did not feel isolating anymore. It felt safe. It felt like a fortress I had defended against a siege. I hung up my silk gown, washed my face, and climbed into bed. For the first time since my grandfather died, I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. I had won the battle of the ballroom. I had proven I would not be a silent victim to their social warfare. But exposing a cornered animal only makes it infinitely more dangerous. Gerald had lost his public standing, which meant he had nothing left to lose. The retaliation arrived the very next morning. I woke up to the sound of sharp, heavy knocking on my front door. I pulled on a thick robe and looked through the peephole. A process server stood on my porch, holding a thick manila envelope and shifting his weight against the morning cold. I opened the door, signed his clipboard, and took the package inside. It was an official mandate from the law offices of John Caldwell. The executor of the estate was issuing a mandatory legal summons for all family members. The reading of the final directives was scheduled for the following morning. Before I could even finish reading the stiff legal jargon on the cover letter, my cell phone began to ring on the kitchen counter. The caller identification displayed Gerald. I almost let it go to voicemail, but my curiosity won out. I wanted to hear what a ruined man sounded like in the harsh light of day. I pressed the answer button and lifted the phone to my ear. Elizabeth Gerald said his arrogant, booming tone was gone. The threatening edge from the previous morning had vanished entirely. Instead, his voice was thin, reedy, and laced with a frantic, sweating desperation. "We need to make a deal," he pleaded, dropping all pretense of patriarchal authority. "I am prepared to offer you $10,000 in cash today, right now, if you sign away your rights and refuse that summons. Do not go to Caldwell's office tomorrow. Please." The hook was set, and the final confrontation was hurtling toward us faster than I could have ever predicted. I pressed the phone tighter against my ear, making sure I heard him correctly. $10,000. A few hours ago, this man was wearing a velvet dinner jacket and mingling with city councilmen, projecting an aura of endless fortune. Now he was offering me a buyout that barely equaled the down payment on a modest sedan. The contrast was startling. Gerald Rose, a man who built his entire personality around high-end country clubs and luxury vehicles, was scraping the bottom of his checking account to assemble a bribe. Gerald always viewed human beings as obstacles. When I was growing up, he never disciplined my brother Kyle for wrecking a neighbor's fence or breaking a window. Instead, my father would simply walk over, peel crisp $100 bills from a silver money clip, and buy the silence of the aggrieved party. He treated morality as a transactional inconvenience. If a problem arose, you threw cash at it until the problem went away. That was his universal solution. "Let me show you," Gerald urged, his breathing uneven. He abruptly switched our voice conversation to a video call. My screen flickered, revealing the interior of his home office. The man on my display looked like a hollowed-out version of the patriarch I knew. His silver hair, usually slicked back with expensive pomade, hung loose and unkempt over his forehead. He had shed the velvet jacket, sitting in a wrinkled dress shirt with the collar unbuttoned. Dark circles dragged down the skin beneath his eyes. He angled his phone downward, pointing the camera at the center of his heavy mahogany desk. Sitting on the polished wood was a thick stack of banded currency. Next to the money rested a single, freshly printed document titled Voluntary Waiver of Inheritance Rights. "I just need your signature on this paper," Gerald pleaded, his tone adopting a sickly manufactured warmth. "The estate is a mess, Elizabeth. Your grandfather left behind a tangled web of outstanding tax liabilities and structural debts. If you attend the reading tomorrow, John Caldwell is going to require everyone present to assume a portion of those burdens. Your presence will only complicate the paperwork. I am trying to protect you. Take the cash, walk away, free and clear." I stared at the screen, analyzing the items on his desk with the same critical eye I used for auditing freight manifests. He was lying. The Rose Legacy Trust protected the assets, meaning any alleged tax burdens were his own invention. But something else caught my attention. Resting just beside the stack of currency was a crumpled carbon copy receipt from a premium overnight courier service. The camera resolution was sharp enough for me to read the red stamped text near the top edge. It was a guaranteed delivery slip addressed to my townhouse, bearing a timestamp from 2 hours before our charity gala confrontation. The timeline clicked into place. Gerald had not drafted this waiver this morning. He had prepared the legal document yesterday afternoon, paying exorbitant fees to have a physical copy expedited to my door. He intended to ambush me with the contract before the sun rose today. His panic was not a sudden reaction to my public defiance at the convention center. His terror had been brewing for days. He knew exactly what Caldwell planned to unveil, and the impending truth was suffocating him. "You overnighted the paperwork already?" I stated, keeping my expression perfectly blank. "The courier receipt is sitting right next to your left elbow." Gerald flinched, his hand darting out to snatch the crumpled paper out of the frame. He swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "I wanted to ensure you had a hard copy to review," he stammered, scrambling to recover his footing. "I am trying to be efficient. The legal fees are piling up, and we need to streamline the probate process." $10,000 is a generous gift for someone in your position." "My position," I repeated, letting a cold smile form on my lips. "You mean the position of the troubled charity case you and Diane invented? You want me to trade my grandfather's legacy for a stack of bills you probably borrowed from a predatory lender." The manufactured warmth vanished from his eyes, replaced by a sudden, scorching fury. The rejection pierced his fragile ego. The cornered animal inside him lashed out, seeking blood. "You listen to me, you ungrateful little brat!" Gerald snarled, leaning so close to the camera that his features distorted. You are not a blood heir. You are a biological mistake. If you step foot inside that law office tomorrow morning, I will unleash my litigation team. I will tie up your life in civil court for a decade. I will garnish your wages. I will force your logistics firm to fire you just to avoid the endless subpoenas. You will spend every waking moment drowning in legal fees until you beg me to take the estate off your hands." His face turned a mottled, furious red. Spit flew from his lips, hitting the camera lens and blurring the image. "Sign the waiver when it arrives," he demanded, his voice echoing in his empty office, "or I will bury you." I did not raise my voice. I did not flinch at his threats. I simply looked at the frantic, sweating man on my screen. "If your handwritten will was valid, Gerald, you would not be offering me cash," I replied. "If your lawyers were truly prepared to bury me, you would not be begging for my signature on a Wednesday morning. You are terrified of John Caldwell. You are terrified of whatever sits inside those sealed folders, and for the first time in my life, I am looking forward to a family meeting." I tapped the red icon, ending the video call. The screen went black, plunging my kitchen back into a peaceful silence. I set the phone down next to the official summons from the executor. The heavy manila envelope bore the distinguished letterhead of the Caldwell Law Group. I ran my fingers over the embossed golden scales of justice near the top corner. Gerald thought intimidation would force my submission. He believed fear was a universal currency, assuming I would fold under the pressure of prolonged litigation. But his desperate bribery attempt had achieved the exact opposite effect. It acted as a blinding spotlight illuminating his profound weakness. My grandfather had not left me defenseless. Thomas Rose was a brilliant, meticulous man. He understood the depths of his son's greed better than anyone. He recognized that Gerald would inevitably attempt to plunder the estate, using every dirty tactic available to seize the land and the capital. To counter that greed, Grandpa enlisted the most ruthless, unyielding estate attorney in the state of Indiana. John Caldwell was not just a lawyer. He was a legal executioner. He held a reputation for dismantling hostile heirs with surgical precision. If Gerald was sweating, pacing his office and offering bribes to keep me out of that specific conference room, it meant Caldwell held the keys to a vault my father could not crack. The pieces of the puzzle were locking together. The trust document resting inside my winter coat pocket. The sudden invention of my adoption status. The frantic social smear campaign designed to isolate me. The overnighted waiver of inheritance. Every single action my parents took over the past 3 days was a desperate scramble to plug a sinking ship. I walked into my home office and booted up my laptop. I did not need to prepare a defense. I did not need to hire a rival attorney or draft a countersuit. I simply needed to arrive at the designated location and let the truth detonate. I drafted a quick email to Hank, informing him I would be taking a personal morning off to attend an urgent legal matter. My boss replied 2 minutes later with a single sentence: "Give them hell, Elizabeth." I closed the laptop and walked to my bedroom closet. I bypassed the casual sweaters and denim jeans. Tomorrow was not a day for blending into the background. Tomorrow required armor. I selected a sharp, charcoal gray tailored suit, a crisp white blouse, and a pair of polished black leather pumps. The outfit projected rigid corporate authority, the kind of attire worn by executives closing major acquisitions. I ironed the slacks, hung the blazer on the doorframe, and prepared my briefcase. Inside, I placed the state title for the vintage Mustang, along with the watermarked corporate holding receipt I had discovered in the glove box. I gathered every piece of evidence required to watch my father's empire crumble. The evening passed slowly. The winter sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, dark shadows across the frost-covered lawns of my neighborhood. I brewed a cup of chamomile tea, sitting by the living room window, watching the streetlights flicker on. My phone remained silent. The courier package holding Gerald's pathetic bribe eventually arrived, dropped onto my porch by a hurried delivery driver. I did not even bother opening the cardboard envelope. I tossed it directly into the shredder bin under my desk. As the night deepened, I felt a strange, quiet calm settle over my mind. The anxiety that had plagued me since the initial dinner ambush was gone. The fear of social exile held no power over me anymore. My parents had tried to erase my identity, steal my assets, and ruin my career. They had fired every weapon in their arsenal, and I was still standing. Tomorrow morning, the battlefield would shift from the country club and the corporate office to a mahogany-paneled room in downtown Indianapolis. The rules of engagement would no longer be dictated by gossip or intimidation. The rules would be dictated by the ironclad laws of the state, administered by a man my grandfather trusted with his life's work. I finished my tea, turned off the lamps, and went to sleep. I was ready to face them. I was ready to listen to John Caldwell open the final chapter of my grandfather's legacy, and I was ready to watch the Rose family learn the true cost of their own deception. The atmosphere inside the mahogany-paneled conference room shifted from tense to suffocating. John Caldwell did not offer the room a chance to catch its collective breath. He possessed the clinical, precise detachment of a seasoned surgeon operating on a fatal wound. The revelation of my secret adoption was merely the opening incision. The true operation, the extraction and redistribution of the family fortune, was about to begin. My grandfather, Thomas Rose, was a man of the earth and the assembly line. He understood the value of sweat, the yield of fertile soil, and the rigid discipline required to build something out of nothing. The Indiana property was not just dirt and corn stalks to him, it was a thriving agricultural enterprise built over 50 years of unbroken, exhausting labor. He had expanded his initial 40 acres into a sprawling 500-acre operation, securing highly lucrative supply contracts with regional grain distributors. Beyond the soil, the estate held diversified mutual funds, municipal bonds, and a pristine vintage vehicle collection. It was a tangible, heavy empire built to sustain future generations. Gerald had spent his entire adult life treating that empire like a personal treasury waiting to be plundered. He had borrowed heavily against his presumed inheritance to fund his failing commercial real estate ventures, assuming his birthright would always serve as a safety net. Caldwell shifted the blue legal cover aside and pulled a final, thick-bound folio from his manila envelope. He placed it squarely in the center of the dark wooden table. "We must now address the disposition of the material assets," the attorney stated. His voice remained steady, a low baritone cutting through the thick silence. My father leaned forward, his knuckles turning pale against the table edge. He was a man drowning, grasping frantically at the last floating piece of debris. He still believed he could salvage a portion of the wealth. He assumed the law provided an unbreakable safety net for biological sons, regardless of any secret adoptions or hidden siblings. Caldwell opened the folio. Pursuant to the explicit instructions detailed in the final estate planning documents, the testator has invoked a strict disinheritance clause regarding his son. Diane let out a sharp, ragged gasp. Gerald opened his mouth to speak, but the lawyer raised a single commanding finger, demanding absolute silence. The clause is triggered by chronic insolvency. Caldwell continued reading directly from the watermarked page. The testator noted your extensive commercial liabilities, the delinquent federal tax burdens, and the impending foreclosure on your primary residence. He determined that transferring any liquid capital or real property into your name would result in immediate seizure by your creditors. The wealth would not sustain you. It would simply evaporate to pay your debts. Therefore, you are formally bypassed in the line of succession. The words struck Gerald like physical blows. The arrogant patriarch, who had spent decades dictating the lives of everyone around him, was publicly stripped of his presumed birthright. He had built his entire identity on the illusion of inherited wealth. Now the illusion was gone, replaced by the crushing reality of his own financial failures. Stephanie and Kyle exchanged panicked, wide-eyed glances. My older sister had always lived light years beyond her means, funding her designer wardrobe and luxury vacations through quiet subsidies from our parents. My brother had burned through countless seed rounds for his failed startups, assuming the farm would eventually be sold to cover his endless losses. They realized that if Gerald received nothing, their own financial lifelines were permanently severed. "Wait," Kyle interjected, his voice cracking with sudden desperation. "If Dad is bypassed, the assets skip a generation. They go to the grandchildren. That means Stephanie and I are the primary beneficiaries." It was a remarkable display of naked self-interest. Kyle did not care that his father had just been financially ruined. He only cared about securing his own payout, ready to step over Gerald to get to the vault. Caldwell adjusted his reading glasses, fixing his stern gaze on my brother. "Your understanding of intestate succession is accurate in standard cases, Kyle. However, this is not a standard case, and this estate is not subject to a normal probate court." The lawyer turned the page, the crisp paper rustling in the quiet room. Prior to his passing, Thomas Rose executed a comprehensive transfer of all real and personal property. The 500 acres of agricultural land, the farming equipment, the investment portfolios, and the vehicle collection were removed from his personal name. They were absorbed into a distinct legal entity known as the Rose Legacy Trust. I watched my family process the terminology. A trust was a fortress. It was a separate entity immune to the standard rules of inheritance and the grasping hands of creditors. "The trust governs the distribution of the $4 million estate," Caldwell explained, "and the deceased was exceptionally clear regarding its administration. Due to the financial instability of his son and the lack of demonstrated fiscal responsibility from his biological grandchildren, the grantor appointed a single individual to manage, control, and benefit from this entity." The silence in the conference room grew so deep it felt pressurized. My mother gripped the edge of the table, her breath hitching in her throat as she waited for the executioner to drop the blade. "The sole appointed trustee and primary beneficiary," Caldwell announced, looking directly at my end of the table, "is Elizabeth Rose." The declaration landed with the force of an earthquake. The fortune my parents and siblings had already spent in their imaginations vanished in a single devastating sentence. Everything they thought they owned belonged to me. Next to my mother, Stephanie sat paralyzed. She had entered the law office wearing a pristine camel hair coat and carrying an imported Italian leather handbag, projecting the image of a wealthy heiress collecting her due. She had looked at me with open disdain, certain I would walk away with nothing. Now the reality of her sudden poverty short-circuited her nervous system. The muscles in her hands simply gave out. The imported handbag slipped from her manicured fingers. It plummeted toward the hardwood floor landing with a heavy, resonant thud. The golden clasp popped open upon impact, spilling expensive cosmetics, a silver mirror, and her car keys across the polished boards. Stephanie did not reach down to retrieve her belongings. She simply stared at her empty hands, her mouth hanging open in silent shock. The physical loss of her grip mirrored the total loss of her future. Kyle slumped back in his chair, the color draining from his face. The endless seed money for his tech illusions was gone. The safety net was gone. He was 28 years old, possessing no real skills, and he was suddenly cut off from the only resource that had ever kept him afloat. I remained perfectly still, my hands folded neatly in my lap. I did not smile or gloat. I felt a profound sense of awe at my grandfather's meticulous planning. He had seen the predators circling his legacy, and he had built an ironclad vault to protect it, handing me the only key. Gerald could not accept the defeat. His survival instincts kicked in, fueled by the terrifying prospect of bankruptcy. He slammed his fist onto the table, the sudden noise causing Diane to flinch. "This is a sham," Gerald shouted, his face flushing a deep, angry red. "You cannot consolidate an entire generational estate into the hands of one person. I will challenge this in court. I will hire a forensic accounting team. We will prove my father was under undue influence. We will pierce that trust and force a standard probate distribution." Caldwell did not recoil at the outburst. He calmly closed the folio and rested his hands on the leather cover. "You will do no such thing," Gerald the attorney replied, his tone chillingly calm. "You lack the fundamental comprehension of the legal instruments at play." The lawyer leaned forward, addressing my father with the patience of a teacher explaining a simple concept to a slow student. When Thomas established the Rose Legacy Trust, he structured it as a revocable living trust. He transferred the deeds and the accounts while he was in perfect health, backed by extensive medical evaluations, to preempt any claims of cognitive decline. Upon his death, that entity instantly converted into an irrevocable trust. The word irrevocable hung in the air a final, unyielding judgment. "The assets do not belong to the deceased anymore," Caldwell stated. "They belong to the trust. Elizabeth controls the trust. You have zero standing to contest the estate because the estate technically holds zero assets. The transition is bulletproof. There is no legal avenue for you to pursue. You are out of options." The fight drained out of my father in an instant. The blustering, threatening patriarch collapsed inward. He stared at the closed folio, his chest heaving as he realized the inescapable truth. The money was gone. The farm was gone. The legacy he had bragged about at the country club belonged entirely to the woman he had tried to erase. He was trapped. His commercial lenders would call in their loans by the end of the month. The federal government would place liens on his remaining accounts. He was a ruined man sitting in a bespoke suit. The power dynamic in the room inverted with dizzying speed. My parents and siblings had spent 3 days treating me like a disposable nuisance. They had orchestrated a smear campaign, attempted to steal my vehicle, and tried to sabotage my career. They believed they held all the leverage. Now they realized their survival depended entirely on my mercy. I watched the transformation occur. The hostility and arrogance melted away, replaced by a sickening, desperate fear. They recognized that threats and intimidation were useless against an ironclad legal fortress. If they wanted to save their home, their lifestyle, and their status, they had to change their tactics. Kyle shifted in his seat, his eyes darting from the lawyer to me. The sneer he usually wore vanished. Stephanie slowly raised her head, tears welling in her eyes, preparing to launch a new performance. Gerald swallowed hard, his pride fracturing under the weight of his debt. The predators were defeated. The beggars were preparing to speak, launching a desperate pivot that would test the very limits of my resolve. The transition inside the mahogany conference room was jarring. For my entire existence, I had watched Stephanie and Kyle model their behavior after our parents. They operated with a distinct inherited arrogance, treating anyone outside their tax bracket as disposable inventory. My brother and sister were raised to believe they were untouchable heirs to a Midwestern dynasty. Now the dynasty belonged to the outcast. The psychological collapse of their entitlement occurred with breathtaking speed. Kyle made the first move. My younger brother was a serial opportunist. When his tech startups inevitably crashed, he never took responsibility. He just shifted his pitch, looking for a new angle, a new investor to drain. Right now, I was the only investor left in the room. He cleared his throat, adjusting the collar of his tailored shirt. The sneer he had worn since childhood vanished, replaced by an unsettling, manufactured sincerity. He pushed his leather folio aside, leaning across the wide table toward me. His eyes, normally sharp and dismissive, softened into wide, imploring pools of false affection. "Wow," Kyle murmured, shaking his head as if overwhelmed by a beautiful revelation. This is a lot to process, but honestly, I think Grandpa made the right call. He knew you were the responsible one. I stared at him, my expression impassive. Just yesterday, this same young man had impersonated family counsel to my logistics suppliers. He had tried to cancel my corporate freight contracts and steal my clients for a vendor kickback. He had attempted to torch my professional reputation to secure a quick payday. Now he was offering me glowing endorsements. You always had the best head for business out of all of us, sis. Kyle continued, his voice dropping into a conspiratorial warm register. The word sis hung in the air toxic and heavy. He had never called me that. To him, I was always the charity case, the outsider taking up space in his house. He extended his arm across the polished wood. His hand reached toward mine, palm open in a gesture of familial solidarity. It was a calculated physical maneuver, designed to bridge the chasm he had spent 28 years digging. He wanted to establish a tactile connection, a physical anchor to secure his claim to my new fortune. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I simply looked at his outstretched fingers, then met his gaze. Slowly, deliberately, I pulled my hands back, resting them securely in my lap beneath the table edge. The rejection was silent but deafening. Kyle's hand hovered awkwardly in the empty space for a painful few seconds before he slowly retracted it, a flash of genuine irritation briefly breaking through his painted-on smile. Stephanie did not miss a beat. Where Kyle tried the angle of a supportive sibling, my older sister opted for theatrical tragedy. Stephanie had honed her acting skills at the most exclusive country clubs in Carmel, perfecting the art of appearing deeply sympathetic while doing nothing to actually help. She left her spilled designer bag on the floor and stood up from her chair. She rounded the edge of the table, taking cautious, deliberate steps toward my end of the room. Her eyes glistened with unshed moisture. It was a stunning performance. She had summoned genuine tears to moisturize a fabricated sorrow. Elizabeth Stephanie whispered, her voice trembling with perfect pitch. I cannot even imagine how overwhelming this must be for you. Finding out about your adoption this way, discovering the truth about Amelia. It is heartbreaking. She stopped a few feet away, pressing a manicured hand over her heart. The hypocrisy was staggering. Less than 48 hours ago, she had stood in my icy driveway, demanding the keys to my vintage Mustang, while loudly declaring I lacked the correct genetics to own it. She had weaponized my mysterious origins to justify stealing my property. Now she was offering a shoulder to cry on. We always loved you, Stephanie pleaded, a single tear escaping to trace a perfect line down her cheek. Mom and Dad might have made mistakes, but Kyle and I always saw you as our true sister. We are a family. This paperwork does not change our bond. I remained seated, my posture rigid, letting her empty words wash over me. I analyzed her performance with the same detachment I applied to a faulty supply chain manifest. She was trying to secure a supply line to my checking account. Her lifestyle demanded a constant influx of capital. Without the grandfather's estate, her premium existence would evaporate within a month. When the emotional appeals failed to produce a tear or a nod of agreement from my side of the table, the siblings pivoted again. The begging morphed seamlessly into a desperate, grasping entitlement. The veneer of affection cracked, revealing the raw, unadulterated greed underneath. Look, we are all in shock, Kyle interjected, his tone hardening just a fraction, the supportive brother act slipping away. But we have to be practical here. Grandpa left $4 million in the trust. You control it, yes, but he meant for that wealth to sustain his descendants. We are his biological grandchildren. That is an undeniable fact. You cannot just cut us out of our heritage. Stephanie nodded vigorously, dropping the sorrowful act to join the negotiation. Exactly. You have the farm and the primary capital, Elizabeth. We are not contesting your role as the trustee. But there is plenty of liquidity in those investment portfolios. $1 million each for Kyle and me would barely dent the principal. It is the fair thing to do. It honors his memory by taking care of the whole bloodline. They were negotiating with funds they did not possess. They were attempting to dictate the terms of a surrender while standing on the wrong side of the battlefield. They expected me to conform to the unwritten social contract of family obligation, the very contract they had shredded and burned when they thought they held the high ground. I sat quietly in my chair. I watched the people who had tormented and sabotaged me for 3 decades reduce themselves to pathetic caricatures of their former selves. They were dancing on strings of their own making. I did not need to hurl insults. I did not need to shout. Their own frantic, groveling behavior was a far greater humiliation than anything I could say. Attorney Caldwell watched the display with narrowed eyes. He remained silent, allowing the disgraced heirs to exhaust their arsenal of manipulation. He knew, just as well as I did, that a trust does not entertain fairness or biological entitlement. A trust honors the ink on the page. I let them talk. I let them present their arguments, their pleas, and their demands. I let them humiliate themselves in front of the executor. The longer I remained silent, the more desperate their pitches became. Kyle offered to help me manage the agricultural logistics, pretending he knew anything about farming. Stephanie offered to introduce me to her high society friends, the same friends she had tried to turn against me at the charity gala just 12 hours ago. My silence was a mirror reflecting their ugliness back onto them. But the chaotic symphony of sibling greed was abruptly interrupted. While Stephanie and Kyle were busy begging for scraps from my table, they had forgotten about the most dangerous person in the room. Gerald had been sitting in his chair, staring blankly at the legal documents resting in front of the attorney. His face had cycled through pale shock, deep humiliation, and quiet despair. But as he listened to his children beg for their allowances, the despair crystallized into something else. The fear of bankruptcy ignited into a blinding, scorching rage. My father was a man who required absolute control. He had just lost his fortune, his reputation, and his authority in the span of 30 minutes. He was backed into a corner with no legal avenues of escape. The realization that his survival now depended on my mercy broke something fundamental inside his mind. The groveling ended when Gerald slammed his palms flat onto the mahogany table. The sharp, cracking sound silenced Kyle mid-sentence. Stephanie jumped back, startled. Gerald slowly rose to his feet, his chair scraping loudly against the hardwood floor. His chest heaved. The polished, velvet-wearing patriarch was gone entirely. In his place stood a desperate, ruined man preparing to wage a final, unwinnable war. He turned his furious gaze away from John Caldwell and locked his eyes directly onto me. The pleas for fairness were over. The demands were about to begin. The patriarch of the family stood at the head of the conference table, his chest heaving with erratic, ragged breaths. The calculated, suave demeanor he had maintained for decades evaporated entirely, leaving behind a raw, cornered animal. Gerald glared down at his biological children, his eyes burning with absolute disgust. He abhorred their weakness, despising the way they had instantly surrendered their pride to beg for an allowance. In his mind, true power was never surrendered. It had to be taken by force. He reached down toward the floor, snatching the leather handle of his imported briefcase. He hauled the heavy bag upward, slamming it onto the polished mahogany surface with a violent thud. His hands trembled as he gripped the brass zippers. He yanked them backward with such frantic aggression that one of the metal teeth warped, jamming the track. Furious, he tore the leather flap open, bypassing the broken zipper entirely. As the briefcase gaped wide, a thick stack of mail tumbled out. The envelope slid across the glossy wooden table, fanning out like a losing hand of cards. They were not prestigious corporate memorandums or exclusive country club invitations. They were bright, aggressive crimson. The glaring red paper caught the fluorescent overhead lighting illuminating the harsh reality of his existence. Stamped across the plastic windows in bold, unforgiving block letters were the words, "Past due." Some envelopes bore the logos of massive financial institutions, while others carried the mundane branding of local utility companies. The sheer volume of the delinquent notices was staggering. Here was a man draped in bespoke tailoring, wearing a luxury timepiece, who could not afford to keep the lights on in his own mansion. Gerald did not attempt to gather the scattered envelopes. He left his shame on full public display. He pointed a shaking finger at the pile of crimson paper, his face twisting into a mask of pure, unadulterated panic. "The facade is dead," Gerald announced, his voice ragged and echoing against the walls. "The commercial properties are completely underwater. The zoning board denied the permits for the East Side development, and the steel suppliers have officially halted all shipments. The lending syndicate is initiating foreclosure proceedings on the Carmel estate by the end of this month. We are drowning!" It was the first time I had ever heard my father speak the truth about his finances. For my entire life, he had operated as an infallible dictator, a man who possessed endless resources and demanded absolute obedience. He controlled his household through financial intimidation. He dictated where we lived, what cars we drove, and what social circles we inhabited, always reminding us that his wealth provided our foundation. His love was entirely conditional, granted only when our actions enhanced his carefully curated public image. Now that foundation was exposed as a hollow, rotting sinkhole. He blamed everyone but himself for the impending bankruptcy. He ranted about predatory interest rates, incompetent contractors, and a failing global economy. He refused to acknowledge his own reckless gambling, his forged loan applications, or his relentless need to project a billionaire lifestyle on a millionaire budget. In his distorted reality, he was a brilliant visionary, victimized by a cruel, uncooperative world. Then his frantic eyes locked onto me. The ranting ceased. The chaotic desperation morphed into a cold, commanding authority. He attempted to resurrect his patriarchal dominance, preparing to wield the heaviest weapon in his arsenal against me. He intended to weaponize my sense of duty. "You are going to fix this disaster," Gerald commanded, taking a menacing step toward my end of the table. "You are going to sign the release authorization today. We are going to transfer the deed for the 500-acre agricultural property directly into my primary holding account before the banks close this afternoon." I stared at him, observing the sheer audacity of his demand. He had spent the last 3 days actively trying to destroy my life. He had authorized the theft of my vintage vehicle. He had orchestrated a vicious social smear campaign to isolate me from our extended relatives. He had allowed my brother to sabotage my corporate freight contracts. He had sat at a dinner table and coldly told me I was a biological mistake, intentionally stripping away my identity to secure his own wealth. Yet standing amidst the ruins of his shattered empire, he expected me to save him. "I need the equity from that farmland to secure a massive bridge loan," he continued, his tone turning sharp and demanding. "I can leverage the soil to satisfy the commercial creditors and stop the foreclosure on the house. The liquid capital in the investment portfolios will cover the delinquent taxes. We can salvage the operation, but you must surrender control of the trust immediately." He was not asking for a favor. He was issuing a directive. "You owe this family, Elizabeth," he shouted, his voice rising to a frantic pitch. "We put a roof over your head. We gave you our prestigious name. We shielded you from the foster system. You have a moral obligation to protect this bloodline. You cannot let the Rose legacy die in a bankruptcy court. You have to do your duty." As his words battered against my ears, a profound internal conflict flared to life inside my chest. My entire professional career was built upon a foundation of crisis management. In the high-stakes world of supply chain logistics, I was the designated savior. When a critical freight route collapsed, I stepped in. When a manufacturing plant faced a material shortage, I rewired the network. My brain was systematically hardwired to assess catastrophic failures, calculate the necessary variables, and execute a solution. I fixed broken things. It was my identity. Looking at the red envelopes scattered across the mahogany table, my logistical mind automatically began crunching the numbers. I knew exactly how to restructure his debt. I knew how to liquidate a portion of the mutual funds, satisfy the federal tax liens, and negotiate a favorable settlement with the commercial lenders. With the $4 million trust at my disposal, I possessed the exact tools required to rescue his sinking ship. The temptation to solve the problem was an incredibly powerful, deeply ingrained reflex. Furthermore, the psychological conditioning of my childhood pulled at my resolve. Every daughter harbors a primal, buried desire to earn her father's approval. Gerald had starved me of validation for 3 decades. Now he was finally looking at me as the most important person in the room. He was implicitly admitting that I held the power, that I was capable, and I was essential to his survival. A small, vulnerable part of my soul whispered that if I saved his empire, he might finally love me. I could buy my way into the family. I could pay the ultimate ransom and secure the belonging I had always craved. He recognized the hesitation in my eyes. He sensed the internal tug of war tearing at my conscience. Like a predator smelling a fresh wound, he leaned harder into the manipulation. "Sign the papers, Elizabeth," he urged, his voice dropping into a dangerous, coercive rhythm. "John Caldwell can draft the transfer agreement right now. Do not be selfish. Do not let your mother lose her home. Do not throw your siblings onto the street. Be the responsible woman we raised you to be. Save us." The weight of his expectation pressed down on my shoulders, heavy and suffocating. My mother watched me with wide, terrified eyes, silently blocking me to submit to his authority. My siblings held their breath, their futures hanging entirely on my impending decision. The family lawyer remained perfectly still, a neutral observer, waiting to see if the victim would voluntarily hand the sword back to her abuser. I looked down at the bright red collection notices. I looked at the panicked, sweating man demanding my submission. I looked at the people who had gladly thrown me to the wolves when they thought it would fill their own pockets. They wanted me to set myself on fire simply to keep their illusions warm. The internal battle reached its agonizing peak. The ingrained habit of fixing disasters collided violently with my newfound instinct for self-preservation. I had to choose between the toxic comfort of manipulated guilt and the terrifying freedom of absolute independence. I took a slow, deep breath, feeling the air fill my lungs, preparing to deliver my final answer. I looked at the man demanding my salvation. The air in the conference room grew stagnant heavy with the suffocating weight of his expectation. Gerald stood there, his chest heaving, his face flushed with panic, fully believing that a lifetime of conditioned obedience would force my hand. He expected the dutiful daughter to fall into line to absorb his failures and to shield him from the consequences of his own disastrous choices. No. The single syllable dropped onto the mahogany surface like a stone. It was quiet, firm, and entirely devoid of hesitation. Gerald blinked his mind, rejecting the input. His jaw tightened as he leaned closer. "What did you just say?" I said. "No, Gerald," I replied, keeping my voice level and calm. "I am not signing the transfer authorization. I am not liquidating the mutual funds to cover your delinquent taxes. I am not leveraging the agricultural soil to secure a bridge loan for your commercial debts. You are not getting a single dime from the Rose Legacy Trust." The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a dictatorship crumbling into dust. "You cannot do this," Diane whispered, her voice trembling as she clutched the edge of the table. "You will ruin us. We will lose the Carmel house." I turned my gaze toward the woman who had spent decades treating me like an inconvenient accessory. "You ruined yourselves, Diane. I am merely refusing to fund the wreckage." Gerald slammed his fist against the table again, though the gesture lacked its former power. It was the frantic flailing of a drowning man. "You owe us," he shouted, his voice cracking. "We are your family. You have a duty to protect this bloodline." I slowly stood up from my leather chair. I looked down the length of the long table, meeting the terrified, desperate eyes of the people who shared my genetics. "You demand loyalty in the name of family duty," I said, my tone echoing with cold precision. "Let us examine how you define that concept." I shifted my focus to my older sister, Stephanie. "You showed up at my home before dawn with a commercial towing rig. You tried to steal a classic vehicle that rightfully belonged to me, claiming my lack of proper blood stripped me of my property rights. You sneered in my face and told me I was a parasite." Stephanie shrank back into her seat, her eyes darting toward the floor, unable to meet my gaze. I turned to my mother. "Diane, you spent the last 72 hours orchestrating a coordinated character assassination. You messaged every relative in our social circle, labeling me an unstable extortionist. You tried to humiliate me at a charity event in front of the local elite, publicly introducing me as your former charity case to assert your dominance." Diane covered her mouth with her trembling hands, choking back a sob of pure panic. I shifted my attention to my younger brother. "Kyle, you impersonated legal counsel. You contacted my corporate suppliers and attempted to cancel my freight contracts to secure an illegal vendor kickback. You tried to destroy my career and torch my professional reputation just to line your own pockets." Kyle looked physically sick, his fabricated supportive sibling routine exposed as a hollow, pathetic fraud. Finally, I locked eyes with Gerald. "And you? You sat at a dinner table and coldly informed me I was a biological mistake. You weaponized the tragic death of my true mother to secure your inheritance. You declared in no uncertain terms that I was not a Rose. You spent 3 days trying to convince the world I was not real family." I paused, letting the unvarnished truth settle over the room. They had built their own gallows. I was simply refusing to untie the rope. "Congratulations," I stated, my voice echoing in the quiet office. "I am honoring your wish. As of this exact moment, I am not your family." I reached down and picked up my charcoal briefcase. I placed the original title for the vintage Mustang inside, alongside the corporate holding receipt. I snapped the brass latches shut. The sharp, metallic clicks signaled the end of the negotiation. "Elizabeth, please," Gerald begged, his voice dropping into a raw, pitiful whine. "You cannot just walk away. We have nothing." I looked at the attorney sitting quietly at the head of the table. John Caldwell had watched the entire execution without moving a muscle. He possessed the quiet satisfaction of a man who had successfully delivered his client's final verdict. "Thank you, Mr. Caldwell," I said, offering the lawyer a polite nod. "I believe we are finished here. I will review the transitional documents you sent over and return the signed copies to your office by Friday morning." Caldwell returned the nod, a faint ghost of a smile touching the corners of his mouth. "It was a pleasure to execute your grandfather's wishes, Ms. Rose. The trust is fully operational." I turned my back on my parents and my siblings. I walked toward the heavy oak door. Behind me, the chaotic symphony of desperation erupted. Gerald began shouting empty threats. Diane started sobbing hysterically, pleading for a second chance. Kyle called out my name, begging me to reconsider. I did not break my stride. I opened the door, stepped out into the hushed reception area, and let the heavy wood swing shut, cutting off their voices entirely. I walked onto the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. As the car descended 34 floors, I pulled my phone from my pocket. I opened my contacts list. I selected Gerald's name and tapped the Block Contact command. I repeated the process for Diane, Stephanie, and Kyle. By the time the elevator doors dinged open on the ground floor, my digital connection to their toxicity was permanently severed. I walked out of the glass high-rise, stepped into the crisp winter air of downtown Indianapolis, and took my first breath as a truly free woman. 6 months have passed since that morning in the mahogany conference room. The dust has settled, and the landscape of my life looks entirely different. I relocated from my suburban townhouse to the 500-acre agricultural property in southern Indiana. The farmhouse is quiet, sturdy, and filled with the memories of the man who genuinely loved me. I utilized the vast space to expand my logistics firm, converting 2 of the massive steel barns into operational hubs for regional freight routing. The expansion created 30 new jobs for the local blue-collar community. Furthermore, I directed a portion of the Trust's liquid capital to establish a permanent educational grant for foster youth in Marion County, ensuring other orphan children have the resources they need to build their own foundations. As for the people who tried to destroy me, gravity took its natural course. Without the safety net of the Rose Legacy Trust, Gerald's financial facade collapsed in a matter of weeks. The commercial lending syndicate foreclosed on the Carmel mansion. The luxury SUVs were repossessed. To avoid federal prison for tax evasion, my father was forced to liquidate every remaining asset and agree to a draconian wage garnishment plan. Today, the man who once wore velvet dinner jackets works a third-shift assembly job at the exact automotive steel plant he tried to leverage against me. He spends his nights inspecting stamped metal parts, drowning in the blue-collar reality he spent his entire life mocking. Diane now lives in a cramped 2-bedroom apartment on the outskirts of the city. Her high society friends abandoned her the moment her credit cards stopped working. The country club erased her name from their registry. My brother's corporate sabotage attempt did not go unpunished. When I submitted Kyle's fraudulent emails to the state regulatory board, it triggered a sweeping investigation. He was fired from his marketing firm and currently faces ongoing civil litigation for tortious interference. Stephanie met a similarly humbling fate. Deprived of her unearned allowance, she was forced to enter the labor market with 0 practical skills. My older sister, who once demanded the keys to my classic car while wearing a camel hair coat, now earns minimum wage, selling cosmetics at a retail kiosk in a suburban shopping mall. They got exactly what they earned. This morning, the sun broke over the rolling southern hills, casting a golden light across the fertile plains of the farm. I walked out of the house holding a steaming cup of coffee. The air smelled of damp earth and fresh pine. I walked toward the detached garage and opened the heavy wooden doors. Sitting on the concrete floor was the candy apple red 1969 Ford Mustang. I slid into the driver's seat, breathing in the familiar scent of old leather and motor oil. I turned the ignition key. The heavy engine roared to life, a deep, rumbling growl that vibrated through the floorboards and settled right into my bones. It was the sound of endurance. It was the sound of loyalty. I pulled the classic car out of the garage, shifting gears as I turned onto the long, winding country road. The wind rushed past the open windows, drowning out any lingering echoes of the past. True wealth is not measured by the numbers in a checking account or the brand of a designer handbag. True wealth is the ability to walk away from toxicity without looking back. It is the power to stand firmly in your own truth, knowing your worth is not determined by the people who refuse to see it. My family tried to bury me under their greed, but they forgot I was raised by a man who taught me how to dig my way out. So, I have to ask you a question. Have you ever faced a moment where the people closest to you tried to tear you down to save themselves? Did you fold under the pressure? Or did you find the courage to draw a line in the sand and walk away? Drop your story in the comments below. I read every single one, because sometimes the bravest thing we can do is share the truth about the fires we survived. If this story resonated with you, if you believe that loyalty is forged by actions and not just by blood, hit that like button and make sure to subscribe. You will not want to miss the next story. Until then, keep your boundaries strong, know your worth, and never let anyone tell you that you do not belong. Stay safe out there. There is a specific haunting silence that settles over a room when the illusion of a family finally shatters. It is not the explosive sound of a sudden car crash or the dramatic shattering of glass, but rather the quiet, suffocating realization that the walls protecting you were made of paper all along. The story of Elizabeth Rose, a logistics expert who watched her parents and siblings crumble under the crushing weight of their own greed in a downtown Indianapolis law office, is far more than a satisfying tale of karmic justice. It is a profound, unsettling mirror held up to the face of modern American parenting. It forces us to peel back the pristine veneer of the traditional household and examine what it truly means to raise a child, to cultivate a legacy, and to carry the heavy mantle of family responsibility. In the relentless pursuit of the American dream, a dangerous and pervasive misconception has taken root in our culture. The belief that providing a luxurious lifestyle is synonymous with providing a moral compass. Gerald and Diane Rose lived in a sprawling Carmel estate, drove luxury SUVs, and held court at high society charity galas. By all superficial, socially accepted metrics, they were successful providers. They gave their children the aesthetic of prosperity. Yet, they were bankrupt long before the bank ever foreclosed on their home. They suffered from a profound, incurable poverty of character. When we look at how they raised Stephanie and Kyle, we see the tragic culmination of parenting devoid of emotional awareness. They modeled a transactional existence, teaching their children that human worth is measured by social standing and financial leverage. By turning their affection into a conditional currency, rewarding blind compliance and punishing independence, they did not raise resilient, empathetic adults. They raised fragile, desperate opportunists. A traditional family structure is meant to be a sanctuary, a secure launchpad from which children can safely explore the world. At the very core of this sanctuary must be honesty and fairness. When parents weaponize a child's identity, as Gerald and Diane did by attempting to use Elizabeth's secret adoption as a tool to disinherit her, they do not merely break a rule of fairness, they commit a profound emotional betrayal. They treated a human being as a financial shield and an expendable asset. The chilling reality is that the Rose parents genuinely believed they were preserving their family name, when in truth, they were actively destroying it from the inside out. They forgot that a family is not a corporate entity to be managed. It is a delicate, living ecosystem of trust. When parents lie to their children about their finances, their history, or their inherent worth, they introduce a quiet rot that will eventually consume the entire family tree. Contrast this hollow, image-obsessed parenting with the quiet, enduring wisdom of Thomas Rose, the grandfather. Thomas represents the bedrock of genuine family responsibility and long-term guidance. He understood that protecting a child requires far more than leaving behind a padded bank account or a vintage Mustang. True parenting requires foresight, immense courage, and the heartbreaking willingness to see the world and one's own children exactly as they are. Thomas saw the predator lurking within his own son. He knew that Gerald's obsession with status and wealth would eventually turn him against Elizabeth. So what did the patriarch do? He did not just teach his granddaughter how to bleed the brakes on a classic car, though those moments of shared blue-collar labor were vital expressions of his love. He built an impenetrable legal fortress around her identity and her future. By executing a secret adult adoption, Thomas provided the ultimate form of parental protection. He armed a vulnerable child against the very people who shared her roof. This is the profound lesson of the grandfather's legacy. True family responsibility means protecting the innocent, even if the absolute worst threat comes from your own blood. Stories like Elizabeth's resonate so deeply within us because they echo the silent, often invisible battles fought inside our own homes. We all navigate the complex web of family expectations, the heavy burden of unspoken obligations, and the lifelong pursuit of our own authentic identities. We read these accounts and see fragments of our own siblings, our own parents, our own quiet rebellions. If you find yourself captivated by these deep dives into human nature, family dynamics, and the relentless pursuit of truth, I encourage you to follow Zara Told Stories. Join our growing community as we continue to explore the profound, often hidden narratives that shape our lives, challenge our perspectives, and remind us that we are never truly alone in our struggles. As we reflect on the wreckage of the Rose family and the quiet strength of the daughter who walked away, we must confront a deeply uncomfortable reality. Society frequently sells us a romanticized, unbreakable version of the traditional family. We are fed the endless platitude that blood is thicker than water, conditioning us from birth to believe that family loyalty is an absolute, unquestionable virtue requiring endless forgiveness and limitless sacrifice. But the saga of Elizabeth Rose strips away this dangerous cliché, presenting a truth that challenges the very foundation of conventional American thinking. The unconventional reality is this blind loyalty to a toxic lineage is not a virtue. It is a profound act of self-harm. We are taught that children owe their parents a debt of endless gratitude simply for the act of basic provision. Gerald attempted to weaponize this exact sentiment, screaming that Elizabeth had a moral obligation to save him from bankruptcy because he put a roof over her head. But provision without love is just captivity. A parent's ultimate duty is to raise a child who is strong enough to walk away from manipulation, not one who is broken enough to endure it. Elizabeth's ultimate triumph was not securing a $4 million estate. Her victory was the realization that she did not have to set herself on fire to keep her abusers warm. Look closely at the foundation of your own life. Examine the hands that laid the bricks and the voices that told you who you were supposed to be. What will your foundation withstand when the storms of truth finally arrive? We spend our entire lives seeking the validation of the people who brought us into this world, terrified that without their approval we are nothing. But perhaps the greatest act of self-discovery is realizing that the family you were born into is merely the starting line, not the destination. The strongest roots are not always planted in the soil of our ancestors. Sometimes, to grow a legacy that actually matters, you must have the courage to burn the diseased orchard to the ground and plant your own seed in the ashes.